You are watching The Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Roundtree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. You'll notice that this video is not live. It is in fact premiering. The reason being is right now, you and I are in Houston.
Yes, we are.
Hanging out with some of our heroes.
Yes.
Hanging out with Jack Deere and Sam Storms. And we're also there with Matt Chandler and then Michael, and Michael probably had to tag along. You know, it's neither here nor there. But we want to pick this up because on Monday, you would have seen a premiere of Alyssa Childers going through Brian Zahnd and going through Richard Rohr and kind of tearing apart some of their arguments and theology pieces. But I read Brian's book to prep for that interview.
Yeah.
And I didn't think 30 minutes on Brian Zahnd with Alyssa was going to be enough. It warranted more discussion. So today in this video, we're going to be tackling the teachings of Brian Zahnd, specifically in a book called Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God. Before we dive into that subject matter, I want to let you guys know that we're an entirely crowd-funded ministry. Remnant Radio is completely supported by viewers just like you. And we get to travel. We get to go to Houston. We get to go to Kentucky. We get to go to Louisiana and Arizona and all these places teaching, preaching, and sharing, but those things are expensive. So if you want to help us do those kinds of trips and get videos with Craig Keener on the Gospel of Mark, or if you want to help us produce our show with lights and cameras and all that good stuff, there are links in the description for you to do that. You can give on PayPal as a one-time gift, or you can give on Patreon. So it's $5 a month. You get access to extra content there on Patreon. We talk about the scriptures there. We talk about, we've got a book clubs that we do on there. We've got all kinds of other content that we're producing on there regularly. Without further ado, I want to introduce you guys to Dawson. Many of you know Dawson. He is the man on my left, not known as Michael. But
not last time I checked.
Never has been known as Michael.
Not on my license.
Dawson, what do you do with us, for us? I mean, I could blow smoke all day. You're a pretty great guy. But tell these guys who you are.
What I do. Okay. Yeah. Mainly, I spend a lot of time just writing and researching for these guys, and spending good time reading books like Mr. Zahn's book. I say good times because I'm trying to be charitable. Yeah. But things of that nature. That's what I do.
Yeah. Dawson does a lot of our study guides. So Dawson makes us look better than we are. Dawson has a master's degree. Dawson actually knows how to use Logos in a meaningful way.
I haven't mastered that.
Okay. I mean, it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to master. Which is odd enough. I bumped into a guy this week who does the software engineering for Logos. Faith Life. Anyway, super cool. Anyway, all that being said, when I preach sermons, when I do stuff here, Dawson does a lot of the research for us, and really excited to be able to partner with him more and more. You'll be seeing a lot more of his face here on the channel. So excited to be moving forward with you on that. Let's talk about Brian's book. You wrote out, as you do, 4 very succinct things that you disagreed with on this book that we're going to be tackling in this video. So what do people have to look forward to in this video particularly?
Succinctly, we have to look forward to his view of wrath, the wrath of God, his view of the atonement, or his the way he kind of describes forgiveness. And then his next thing is really his hermeneutic. And lastly, just his rhetoric. Yeah. So that's kind of a summary of the 4 parts.
Yeah, and those things are very involved. Those things are all very, very tied together because he'll make a point, but then he will bolster that point with tons of rhetoric. He gets to that point because of the way that he handles specific scriptures. And again, to be charitable, there was in the beginning of chapter 8, there's a really sad story where he loses his dad. And then I think he speaks of another rabbi, I think in addition to that as well, that he had lost. And he's in an elevator thinking about their death. And, they didn't have relationships with Christ. And he was like, well, man, are they in hell? And I think that experience, if I'm going to be as charitable as I can, I think that experience has painted his theology on this given subject, because the idea that these good moral people that are in hell and they're away from God for eternity is a grievous thought to Brian, and is a grievous thought to many of us.
Yes.
For me, I think it would be a motivation to actually do evangelism. For Brian, he looks at the scriptures and then goes, man, is that really what they mean? Is that really what they say? And I think that's a slippery slope. But again, I want to be charitable. That's about as charitable as I can be about this book. And I don't mean to be rude or mean. I think there's people who follow Brian who are going to watch this video. I think Brian might watch this video. And I don't want to be hateful towards him. But I don't think, well, we'll circle back around to that to the end. We'll circle back around that to the end. Let's dig into this. Let's talk about the wrath of God. Let's start off there. Okay. How would you like me to start? Should we read the quotes from Brian, or should you want to unpack what he believes, read the quotes? How do you want to go about it?
One thing we should do is just go ahead and lay out his thinking in regards to the wrath of God. Very simply, the name of the title of the book kind of sums it up, is Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God. Now, what he does with the wrath of God is find a way within his own hermeneutic to dismiss with it by, in shorthand, you can say, by basically making an anthropomorphism, which is just a poetic way of describing God in human terms. And because it's that, he says it's non-literal. Because it's non-literal, it should not be taken as an attribute, so therefore it's a metaphor, not an attribute. Deal done. And that's succinctly put. Now, of course, his argument's going to be a little more complicated than that because he wants to put some stuff under that. But
he had 8 chapters to write.
That's that's not about a paragraph, and that doesn't make a good book.
Yeah.
But so that's basically what he does with the wrath of God throughout, especially the first chapter. But why don't we read some quotes?
Okay.
And that'll give people some flavor, I guess.
Okay. So these quotes are ultimately how Brian is going to redefine suffering in such a way or redefine wrath in such a way that it's actually the consequences of human actions rather than the active judgment of God, right? So here's the quotes that we have from his book here. The revelation that God's single disposition towards sinners remains one of unconditional love does not mean we are exempt from consequences of going against the grain of love. So again, God's plan is love, and we go against the grain of love, there's going to be consequences, is what he says. It says, when we live against the grain of love, we suffer the cards of self-inflicted suffering. This is the wrath of God. Here's another quote. He says, if we are against the grain of love, we will suffer the shards of self-inflicted suffering. And we can call this the wrath of God, if we like. But the deeper truth remains. God is love. You no longer need to sit in the dark with the tormented idea that God somehow harbors malice and ill will towards you. It's all a cruel fiction. That all would be a cruel fiction. So here in both of these quotes, we see Brian attributing the wrath of God. It's called the wrath, but really what it is just the consequences of human suffering. If I was going to proof text this view myself, I don't remember Brian doing this, but if I was going to proof text this view myself, I'd probably go to Romans because Romans says, hey, God gave them over. Right? He had them, they decided to worship the created thing rather than the creator. So he gave them over to debased mind. The consequence for their sin was allowing them to think that way, allowing them to go. And again, that's not how I understand the passage to actually read out. But if I was going to try to proof text this is the way that I would do it. Toss it to you. Self-inflicted. Is wrath a self-inflicted consequence, or is wrath active judgment?
Okay, I want to start with,
and prepackage it if you need to.
I want to just start with explaining where he's coming from. From what I can understand, Zahnd doesn't give references. He doesn't let you know where his ideas are coming from. He doesn't do into the more academic side of things because it's a what is it called, an easy read, or a general audience read. So where he's beginning is with a guy named C.H. Dodd. C.H. Dodd did a work on the wrath of God, and what he did was he first looked for biblical evidence. Anytime we're going to define an attribute of God, we want to do 3 steps. We want to start with biblical evidence, we want to move to biblical theology, and then we want to do a systematic synthesis. What does the whole Bible teach on this issue? So that beginning point of biblical evidence, he basically lays out, Dodd does, that, okay, I'm seeing nothing but the wrath of God being an active agent. In other words, there's 2 sides. There's effective and affective. So in short, like the verb, the Greek form, hardly ever does the verb like anger or wrath refer to God, but refer towards something else. So it's an what you see is like an effect, not an affect. Affect would be subjective. Effect would be objective. So in that, he says, oh, okay, well, I see all this effect. So obviously, wrath seems to be an impersonal force based upon the moral order of the universe that is the result of our consequences of sin.
So it's a built-in mechanism in the universe that punishes wrong behavior.
Yeah, and
not active.
And then from that construction, he then says it's got to be impersonal. So it's not subjective. It's not God being angry and mad. And Zahn's running with this. So he sees that. He says, that's got to be it. Okay, and he runs with this. Problem is, I think as Stephen Wellum puts it best, any biblical theology that is worth its salt must take account of all the biblical data.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not all the biblical data, particularly in Hebrews. What's the famous verse in Hebrews where he says, it is a
fearful thing to fall into the hands. Yeah, but literally, Jonathan Edwards' sermon, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God, of a living God. That idea is what Jonathan Edwards preached his sermon on, which is what Zahnd is writing his book in refutation to.
Ironically.
But
in Hebrews, most every reference to the wrath of God in Hebrews, you have the Greek verb referring back to God affectively. So it's describing an emotion God is having.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the truly Jewish book of the Bible. And you can even just go to you go to the Old Testament, you see what is considered the core list of God's attributes when Moses is in the rock, a cleft of the rock.
He says he's a jealous God.
Yeah, he says he's a jealous God, and he says he's slow to anger, which means he does have anger.
Mm-hmm.
He's just slow to anger. And first of all, that's a great starting point of understanding what is really meant by wrath.
Mm-hmm.
He is not an off-the-handle God.
Mm-hmm.
He is very slow to angry. And when he gets angry, he doesn't like being angry, but he's angry.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this picture in the Old Testament that's very consistent of a God like that. You have the biblical evidence that shows that there is an affective nature as well as an effective nature. So what is going on here in terms of the attribute? So we looked at the biblical data, and we can say, okay, so obviously there is an aspect that's going to show, not just in Hebrews, but in other areas, that it's an emotion God has that is the result of things being out of order in the universe, sin. So there was a time when wrath wasn't. That was before creation, before the fall, when everything was in harmony, when God himself in himself was in harmony. Never not been in harmony, but you know what I mean.
Certainly.
So before creation, because wrath is God's response to sin in the world, shorthand wise. So with that said, that's how God, he didn't look at all the evidence. So most systematic theologians are going to look at that evidence and say, well, he needs to add this, which reframes everything. Now we have a God who can get angry, but is slow to anger. And it is always in response to a situation outside himself. Well, there's some other categories we need to add into that to really flush out what is meant by let's go ahead and do this. What is really flushed out by the wrath of God. Another aspect is we need to differentiate between the wrath of God at the end of time, at the final judgment, and the wrath of God in time.
Mm-hmm.
That's another category we need to do. And the other, there's one more category is we need to understand how we see the wrath of God within his own nature, within himself, and how we see the wrath of God in relation to creation. So, because those are two different aspects. Because one, throughout Scripture, you're going to always see, yes, God responds with judgment, and then he responds with mercy. These are dualisms.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. Because at the essence, God's wrath is his jealous love against sin, mainly. Well, if it's God's jealous love, then he's a bitter lover. Just because I say, what about those times when I just say, I want to be left alone. So he's just a bitter, jealous lover if I just want to say, leave me alone, and he punishes me for that. Well, that forgets one key aspect. He's also creator. That means he has ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So as a God who has ownership of us, we have an obligation to him. And he's not a God, kind of like Marcionite God, who seeks after you as a jealous lover, pleading with you to come to him.
Mm-hmm.
Not as one who is the creator over the world and has the right to say, you are my creation, you're my creature, the best thing for you because of who you are, because of the Trinity. I think we talked about this other day. Because of the Trinity, for God to say it is the best thing for you to worship me. It is the greatest thing you could do is worship me. People would go, that's just selfish and icky and well, it would be if God wasn't other-centered, because God, in his nature as the Trinity, is a being that is self-giving within himself. They call it the pericardia, perichoresis. Pericardia is the heart.
Yeah.
But perichoresis. In the perichoresis, God is self-giving within himself. The Father gives to the Son fully, and the Son gives to the Father fully, and the Holy Spirit gives to the Son and the Father fully, and they give to him fully. And there's this beautiful self-emptying and receiving of the other within the Trinity's members themselves. They are other-centered beings. And because they are other-centered beings who are, because they're the creator, because I shouldn't say they, because the Trinity itself is the creator, the center of existence. For them to say worship us is actually the most loving thing they could ever do. And it's not a selfish love that wants worship. It's the understanding that they are the highest, that the Trinity is the highest value, is the highest beauty, is the highest essence of anything to be worshipped.
Mm-hmm.
God himself, in that way, is the highest value of all values. And in that, getting off track there, but in that, he is worthy of worship. So that kind of wrath is such an interesting subject, in that how did we get from wrath to worship? Because that was just cutting off some objects, some things people say.
Yeah, I want to riff off of you for a second.
Okay,
you mentioned Marcion, and there's some quotes in here that are non-Trinitarian that aren't in our notes that I want to pull up. And I want to pull through those three categories that you just mentioned on the wrath of God. We can walk through some of those categories. And I also want to just speak, if we want to add another one, on wrath as this outburst of anger and this just standard, this just response. Because again, I feel as if Zahnd is making the idea of wrath in the Western view of wrath as, again, drunken dad coming downstairs ready to beat up humanity, and Jesus jumps in the way and says, no, dad, beat me up instead. It's inherently non-Trinitarian. It's inherently this idea of cosmic child abuse. It's not Christian. Mm-hmm. And he does this thing in the book, throughout the book, where he starts appealing to church history. This would have been foreign to Aquinas. This would have been foreign to whoever and whoever and whoever. And I'm sitting here reading this going, either there are two options. One, which I think is more likely, you are lying. Or two, you're woefully ignorant of church history. And I mean that I'm not a scholar of the patristic period. I'm not a scholar of history in general when it comes to church history. But I know that this is a woeful overstatement when, again, this is just a quote. When he talks about, God, and this is, again, contrasting this, God is not this faceless white giant from a chick flick. God is like Jesus. Okay. If we just take a pause right there, we'll keep going. Okay. Just because that's a non-Trinitarian thing to say. Jesus is God, right? Like, God is like Jesus. No, Jesus is God. God has always been like Jesus. There was never a time when God was not like Jesus. We haven't always known this but now we do. God is like Jesus. God is not a sadistic monster who abhors sinners and dangles them over a fiery pit. God is exactly how Jesus depicted him in the most famous parable, a father who runs to receive and embrace the restorative of a prodigal son. It's not a chick track or a Puritan sermon that perfectly reveals the nature of God, but Jesus. Again, over and over, he's going to contrast this idea. There's this God in the Old Testament that we see, and he's not like Jesus. And Zahnd is going to use that as his hermeneutic, and we're going to get to his hermeneutic later, so I apologize that I'm kind of getting ahead of the bus.
We should have started with that,
yeah, at least potentially. It's one of those things where you can see them being pit against each other. And when we're talking about the wrath of God, you see how here he is positioning Jesus as if Jesus is different than this God who has wrath. And then later he's going to say, well, actually, God doesn't have wrath at all. So let's pick up what you were talking about. You said you have these categories of wrath that you were talking about. I felt the need to jump in there, talking about this Marcion. For those of you who don't remember, we've done shows on this in the past. Marcion lived, I think, in the 1st or 2nd century. And he comes out saying, hey, guys, the God of the Old Testament was this mean and evil God who was trying to destroy us, and Jesus comes to save us from that guy. They're not the same God. And really what Brian is articulating here, if we're going to take him at his word, is that he doesn't believe the Old Testament scriptures are valid for us today because he believes they're full of errors that contradict the image of Jesus. Now we can use them and really distort them and manipulate them in some kind of, prophetic-y, let's look to the meaning behind the meaning, let's see the shadow of these truths, and maybe these people were just doing their best job to articulate what they could of God. But ultimately, if you take Brian Zahn's approach to the Old Testament, you might as well wad it up and throw it away. You're not going to need it because it doesn't do a good job of revealing who Jesus is. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to the wrath of God. You had some categories for us.
The categories, you lost me on the categories.
That's okay. You've got 3 categories of wrath that you mentioned that you wanted to touch on. And I said maybe we should touch on the emotional side of wrath and the actual justice piece of wrath. That it's not this vengeful, flying off the handle, lost track of himself kind of wrath. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah.
It's not an outburst of anger.
Yeah, just generally speaking, when it comes to God's wrath, there's categories. See, I'd totally forgotten. You know how my brain works.
It's okay.
I sit there and days out for days on end. But basically, wrath. When you're dealing with wrath, you gotta have proper categories which are set up by the Trinity itself. Okay. Such as the essence of the Trinity. What about wrath within the Trinity? A good way of understanding wrath, and its classical definition as an attribute, is to understand it as God's jealous love directed towards sin. Mm-hmm. But that does make God to appear to be a jealous, jilted lover, but he is the creator, so we have an obligation to him. So it's not a jilted lover, it's more like a father taking care of a child. Any father will tell you have to be slow to anger. Mm-hmm. A good father is going to be slow to anger, but a father who doesn't care if their child gets kidnapped or killed or hurt is a bad father. Why? Because the opposite of love is not wrath. This is what Zahnd contrasts. He thinks wrath and love are opposites. They're not. The opposite of love is indifference, not wrath. Wrath is an aspect of showing true love against those things that would hurt your love.
Agreed. Yeah, like I love dogs. I mean, they're not my favorite thing in the world. I'm probably not going to buy one, but I love them. They're fun to play with, fun to pet. If one of them bit my kid, like I would take a baseball bat to their head, right? Like, I mean, again, like if something is trying to hurt my child, I'm going to get a letter from PETA. You know what I'm saying? Like it's going to happen. Like, and God's going to say, well done, my good and faithful servant. At least I believe. Mm-hmm. I can actually have love and affection towards something, but when that something that I actually care for comes after what I actually love, what I love supremely, indifference. It does not show love to my child to be like, oh, the things like got its teeth sunk into, just love him and forgive him. It's like, Dad, it's killing me, and it's just like, you do you and let him do him and it's all good. And, drink some kombucha and eat some avocado toast, and this will be great. And like, it really is the kind of model that he is portraying of God. God, he doesn't have this emotional wrath. He doesn't really care. I mean, and if we're gonna play the rhetoric game, let's think about the rape. Let's think about the murder. Let's think about those horrible, atrocious sins.
Yes.
And then just think, God, he doesn't have wrath towards those things. That's not good.
Yeah, well, that's a sign of an indifferent, dispassionate is the term.
Yeah.
God, that's the deistic God. That's the God off up there who does not care. And in no way, at no time, even though God is holy, which easily defined is God is different from us in all possible categories.
Mm-hmm.
To be holy is he is totally other. And from being totally other, he then has a purity in himself that we are to emulate. We are to be different in a analogical way. In other words, we're different to other people. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, getting into ethics there.
Similar but different.
Yeah, similar but different. So now when you get to getting at love from that aspect, another analogy is good. Is understanding what we're talking about is like a kingly wrath. If any of your servants are being hurt, if any of the people that are under you are being hurt, and for you to be indifferent in those moments is not loving, it is actually way terrible. Because in both the father incidents and the kingly incidents, any kind of restorative justice is not going to help.
Right.
Because retributive justice is true. And if you most of the time people are going to come out and say, "Oh, no. The Bible never speaks of retributive justice. It only speaks of redemptive justice."
Define retributive justice for people who are like, okay, what meaneth that?
A retributive justice would be just that most of the time the way it's described in a negative light is an eye for an eye. But that's often used very negatively. But you wouldn't have a justice system without an eye for an eye, because that's just how justice works. It's a balancing of the scales.
And when I read wrath throughout the Old and New Testaments, and I think of retributive justice, I think of stories of, easy New Testament verses, Ananias and Sapphira. Mm-hmm. I think of Herod, the voice of a God, not of a man. God strikes him dead, get eaten by worms, mm-hmm. right? I think of the book of Revelation. Those are all New Testament, right? I've got Noah in the Old Testament, eradicates all of mankind with the exception of a small family. I think of, I wrote some of these down, destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Those are all retributive justice. You've done wrong, mm-hmm. and I am going to be moved to action in vengeance. And not just vengeance that's like the Dark Knight, I'm working outside the bounds of the law, right? We're talking about... I
have issues I need to deal with.
I'm gargling marbles. But like for real, Jesus gets involved. God gets involved to the point that he acts to defend his people. Sodom and Gomorrah would have been a destruction to Lot and to Abraham, and God intervenes. Think about being raised in a culture where a beautiful man walks into the community and every single man in the community wants to rape the angel man that they see. To be raised in that culture is to be raised as a child in abuse and to be raised up to become the abuser. Mm-hmm. The idea of God eradicating this from the planet to both, one, protect his people, and the people who are going to be raised up in that culture was an act of mercy. Yes. And again, we have these views of, wrath, as in like, wait, why are you going to kill Agag and all of Agag's family? Like, don't you, like, that doesn't seem fair. But then we read later, because they didn't kill all of Agag's family, this Joker comes back in his great-great-grandkids and tries to take out Esther. Like, there's actually responsible, like, God is actually completely aware of the things that are happening out throughout human history. And when he commands certain acts of absolute justice, that there's a reason for it. And he doesn't just arbitrarily go, hey, these guys are bad, I'm going to destroy them. He waits for their sin to actually reach an apex. Is it the Amorites? It's one of the ites. I don't know if it's the mosquito bites or the dynamites or who it is, but one of the ites, I think it's the Amorites. He's like, hey, you're going to go judge those guys. You're going to go fight and war with them, but not yet, their sin hasn't reached its fulfillment yet. Like he waits for them to become as sinful as they can be or will be before he brings judgment,
Yes.
because it would not be right to respond with a level of wrath had it not been for that level of sin. So he's slow to anger, being patient with them before he brings judgment.
And it's not just there again. Let's one of our other categories to help us think straight on this.
Okay.
Wrath in response to the end of time, the final judgment, and wrath that happens in time. What often happens is people will just talk about one, because the wrath at the end of time, that's the wrath that we're saved from. And if you're still kind of like, I don't know if wrath is compatible with love. Just one verse, Romans 3. The famous Romans 3 verse. While we were yet sinners, what's the rest of it?
Christ died for us.
Christ died for us. That's not the verse I'm thinking of, but
is that not the one?
No, yeah.
Galatians. Was I quoting Galatians and not Romans? That we were all had, but now the righteousness of God has been revealed apart from the law. That's Romans 3. I'm just gonna start randomly quoting Romans 3 verses until we get there. You got the venom of asps is under their tongues. Their feet are swift to shed blood. No one is good. No, not one.
Okay, Romans 5:8.
Romans 5. Okay.
Not bad.
I do feel like you asked me a question on Romans 3 with a quote from Galatians, and I was like, is this me or?
That was my topsy-turvy.
Okay, keep going.
Okay, no.
Let's keep this guy centered though, or else nobody will be able to hear you.
Okay, here's what the verse basically Paul saying that while we were still sinners, and if we're still sinners, therefore we're under the wrath of God. While we were still sinners and under the wrath of God, he had animosity. There was a, I don't like the situation they're in. I don't like them because they're enemies. We're at enmity. We're
by nature children of wrath.
Yes, exactly. God showed his love for us in Christ. So there we have.
You can straighten that guy up. Sorry, I crookeded it out for you.
There we have a picture of both. The experience of a sinner is both there in the eyes of love and in the eyes of wrath in God. God knows that they're an enemy. God knows who they are and where they are. God, even though that, still loves them. So there's both wrath and love in God. In that verse, it shows us that there's both wrath and love at the same time, because wrath and love are not that different. But we have to qualify it to keep it from what moderns make it into, is this jilted, jealous lover that's selfish and monstrous, as it's often put.
Yeah.
But the truth is, no. He loves what has destroyed his creation, which is sin and sinners. And there are times in Scripture, and there are times in the Greek where the object of wrath is the person, the sinner. And there's times, more often, that it's the sin, that it's this both principle and action in the world that is out of harmony with the way he meant the world to work.
Yeah.
So there's both aspects there. One has a greater gradient than the other when you look at the scope of the biblical data, which gives us an idea. It puts everything in perspective. But we can never say that there isn't this aspect where we are enemies of God as unbelievers. But what we have to understand is that at the same time, God loves us and does not want us in that situation. So there is a harmony there, even though he hates the situation. He hates who we are. And if you've ever had a friend or a family member who was caught in something that they willingly went into, whether it be, a heroin addict or anything, and it's extremely frustrating, and I don't want to be misheard in terms of making a victim into the perpetrator, but it's very frustrating when you're like, please stop hurting yourself.
Yeah.
And yet those people don't. It's just extreme. And at the same time, there's something of that that's going on there. But at the same time, that's anytime you make a weak analogy to a human situation, and transpose it on God's attributes, you initially pervert the attribute. And even in my mind right there, I'm just going, okay, that's
this is where it falls short.
This
That's
is
where it falls short.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about, like, I want to riff off of you, and I want to talk about, like, that Western view of justice and how that could affect our view of wrath. While you kind of set up your next point on the wrath as we're going through these points, but I think of Singapore, right? And when I think of Singapore, this is a place where you litter, you get fined, you litter twice, you do time. It's serious consequences for actions. And you go to the Middle East, and the kind of justice they have there, the idea of a wrathful God just makes sense. But we live in this Western culture where, this is the time to turn off your, audio player if you've got kids in the car. But you hang out in a place where there are pedophiles who take advantage of children, and they get a slap on the wrist. They might do some time, maybe, right? But then they get put on a watch list, and there's nearly no effect on their life. These people should receive the just penalty of their actions for afflicting and wounding and forever scarring a child forever. And they go on to be perpetrators 3, 4, 5, 6 times, some of these jokers. And it is shameful. And we live in a culture where, our kids take tests and the teacher says, hey, you failed this test. And then it's like, well, can I retake the test 2 times, 3 times, 4 times because I didn't study? And we live in a culture that doesn't have active consequences for screwing up, for doing the wrong thing. And it makes perfect sense that we would then take our system of morality and then project that onto God and say, well, if I couldn't do that, if I couldn't punish little Johnny, say, nope, you've got to repeat the 3rd grade because you were lazy and didn't do your job. I couldn't do that. Well, then how could God do that? Right? If I can look at my own standard of morality and then go, well, if I as a human, I have these standards of morality, well, God must be like me. And Zahnd does this a lot in his book, absolutely clearly says, and if you couldn't do that, are you saying that you're more moral than God? Mm-hmm. This is an actual argument he uses in this book. He tries to appeal to your Western senses of justice and morality, and then God at court. I get frustrated. Clearly I'm getting worked up here, but I turned my mic down a lot for this interview. It's one of those things where it's like, hey, let's have our own standard of morality of what's good and what's evil and what's bad. And then let's put God on trial. And let's say, God, you're too mean. And then if that's the case, and we know that God is eternal and better than we are, then we'll reinvent God to look like us. And that's what happens over and over in this book.
Yeah. And just to your point first on the point on the justice system, I would say Zahnd is somewhat right with Dodd in his agreement with Dodd that one way God's wrath is mediated out in the world is through, and I think Zahnd disagrees with this, I'm not sure, but Paul doesn't, because Paul says in Romans 13, basically that this one way, that through governmental systems, you have the mediating of justice.
That's right, yeah.
So
the government bears a sword.
The government bears a sword. So there's an aspect of that comes out through the moral order. Now, to your second point, you're exactly right. He says, oh, well, it's an anthropomorphism, so wrath doesn't exist. It's just a metaphor. And then he turns around and constantly does that back to God. He turns the whole thing back around on him, and then says, oh, well, God should look like you.
Or should look better than you.
He's saying, and he actually has a complicated hermeneutic on this, but at the same time, it's
complicated or conflated. Those two words are very similar as far as I'm concerned. Because he'll do that. He'll go, hey, God in the Old Testament required child sacrifice. He told Abraham to kill Isaac. Now, obviously, we won't say that's an authentic thing. Like, God didn't really ask him to do it, right? Because he saved Isaac eventually. But what if God asked you to kill a kid? Would you be willing to kill a kid? And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, absolutely, he wouldn't, right? But he told people to kill the Canaanite children and this and that. And are you saying that your morals are better than God's? You see how subversive the rhetoric, we're going to get to rhetoric later, but it is It is snaky. I have got no other way of saying it. There's a guy who talks like that in the Bible, and it's crafty as frick.
Has God? I mean, anytime you hear someone saying, "Has God really said?" Ask yourself, who's the first person that said that? You know, I mean, hello.
But, say it again, but the people in the back. No, sorry, you gone. I'm getting preachy.
But to your point, when we get in a system, or let's just say this, moving on from his attributes, from his attribute, because that's his argument. It falls short because it doesn't take the whole scope of data into place. But let's get on to what really is the meat of the book, which is his hermeneutic.
Okay.
His hermeneutic.
Well, let's do this because we are at 40-minute mark right now. I say we wrap up this video and we release it on Wednesday, and then you and I just start up round 2 and go through hermeneutic in the other one, because we have so much material here. There's so many quotes, and I don't want to be like, again, I'm not trying to be mean of Zahnd, but this is low hanging fruit. This stuff is not hard to pick apart. Like, I think anyone who has any level of academic training, I don't have any academic training, and I'm sitting here reading this going, these are just false binaries that you're setting up. These are clever ways of wording questions to win over the audience to your position. This is not an honest reading of the text. This isn't an honest representation of your opponent. This isn't. I mean, it's
well, the sign of
intentional deception.
The sign of a good pastor is the ability to win over a crowd on an issue that is diametrically opposite to the culture the crowd is in.
Yeah,
that's the sign of a good preacher. The sign of a weak preacher is someone who can win over a crowd by appealing to the cultural mores of that culture and change the text in the process to do it.
Yeah, that's a quote graphic. It's coming, y'all.
Yeah, so that is just a person can be very powerful in their presentation, but very weak in content. And honestly, that's some of what we're dealing with here. Yeah. And I would say, I want to say this, because you're going to put this in the show notes, and I think anybody who's watching this, I do not do justice to this article by Tony Lane, who writes on the wrath of God, and he lays out a full systematic treatment of it. It's one of the best I've ever read, and it thoroughly goes through what the wrath of God is, and he is pulling from deep wells of theology. Now, even in his, he lays out 3 points, I'll let y'all read through them, but he lays out 3 points about why the wrath of God is why people resist it so much today. And those 3 points, I think, are very key, because that's why books like this cater to people so well. And just one of the points is a genuine theocentric concept of God is intolerable, because if there is any room for God in a world come of age, it is of a God whose purposes are to serve humanity. That's why a theocentric God is rejected, because no, aren't you supposed to serve me? So, because in our age, we're very anthropocentric. So another one is follow any God who wishes to be accepted today must be a tolerant God who respects human rights, rather than a God who has the right to call for obligation. And the last is, the sentimentality of the Enlightenment has given birth to a sentimental view of God that is akin to Marcionism. Now,
and full circle.
Yeah, I mean, and he lays into that. One of the most famous writers on the love of God, Anthony Nagel, N-Y, I can't remember how it's spelled. It's very weird spelling, but he basically says that anytime you do not treat the wrath of God with the place that the biblical data gives it, you, by subtraction, make the God you proclaim Marcion sentimentality. And I was just like, wow. First of all, highly acclaimed theologian. Second of all, that he would just, he lays the gauntlet out there. So when we're dealing with things like the wrath of God, if you are finding a way to dismiss it, my question to Zahnd is, I'm sure you had personal struggles that brought you to where you are.
Sure.
But my question would be to him is, how much of your culture influences your reading versus how much of your reading is true hermeneutic? You're not importing these cultural ideas. You're not seeing what's playing well against the crowd and leaning into that versus trying to see what's in the text and teach it to a people who may be not liking it very much.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I want to walk through some of these things of contemplation that you wrote out here, theological arguments for wrath. If you diminish the wrath of God, you diminish the seriousness of sin. Mm-hmm. That's an honest, like when we look at the cross, we can see the wrath of God. When we look, and again, Zahn's going to undermine that theory, but when we look to what it cost to free us from our sin and the wages of our sin, that is death, to actually see that weight, that to diminish the wrath of God is to diminish the costliness of our sin. Important point. 2, if you diminish the wrath of God and the seriousness of my sin, you diminish the love of God, which is stunning in that God loves me even though I am a sinner and an enemy of God. We've spoken of this earlier, but again, unpacking this, that is it really this kind of like self-sacrificial love to go after a sinner if you're not really at war with them? Like it contrasts the story to show how great a love that God has had for us, that we were at war with him. There was enmity between the seed of the woman and the child, right? This child is the son of God, the seed of the woman, this soon coming king, if you will, what do they call it? The proto-evangelion, the first mention of the gospel, and the seed of the woman. Jesus comes on the scene saying, you're the son of the devil. There's war between us and God. And he comes preaching this new kingdom. We're at war with him. And he loves those people.
How great is love if it loves the lovely? How great is love if
even you can do that. Even the sinful world can do that. That's right.
Romans 5 makes a contrast between God's love. Paul makes this contrast between God's love and human love. And he says, human love is nothing like God's love. Human love makes comparisons. God's love initiates.
That's right.
So there's this beautiful beauty. But what does God's love do? God's love loves the unlovely. God's love loves the enemy. God's love cares for that which appalls him.
Which is basically your point number 3 here. We talk about if you diminish the love of God for a sinner, you diminish the total stunning forgiveness of a sinner like me. And so his love for me as a result is really not that astounding. Which again, we're just talking about the depth and the breadth of God's love. It really, it affects the way that we view sin. It affects the way that we view anthropology. Point 4, if you diminish God's forgiveness of me, you diminish my ability to forgive others, because my ability to forgive others is affected by my understanding of God's astonishing forgiveness towards me. Again, beautiful points, talking about anthropology, talking about our sin, how we wrestle through that. These all are contrasted in, even in the Old Covenant. Choose this day whom you'll serve, right? You got blessing, you got curses. Pick one. Like this is a classic, like I have come to give life in all of its fullness. The enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Yes. And here are these contrasting pieces. And I want to give you that blessing. I want to give you that astounding love, if you will. Point 4, if you diminish God's forgiveness, we just did that. Point 5, God's love becomes sentimental and all to God's love becomes sentimental and all too human. All too human. I see. Human. Different kind of too human, because it really is not that unusual to love someone who is really not that bad. Again, not a stunning love if you're just loving a common folk. Hey, he's all good, he's great. It doesn't display the beauty of God's love. In no way can the view of God's love and graciousness actions produce in the human heart a gratitude free of enlightenment. At best, it affirmed a basic goodness assumed of all humanity and shows God to be a dutiful God who faithfully keeps his obligation to sinners who are really God's people who have done some bad things. They feel bad about it and forgive their sins. So these are a good summation of the reasons that we want to hold on to the wrath of God, a biblical definition of the wrath of God. It's not just because it's true, because it would be enough. Yes. If it affected nothing else, that the attribute of God should be defended by his people because we actually love him.
Yes.
And for us to...
And the Bible actually states it.
That's right.
Because I would stand here, if the Bible didn't state it and Zahnd was right on that point.
We would say yes and amen.
I would say the Bible doesn't state it. You know, everybody believes it, but the Bible doesn't state it.
Right.
But in this case, the Bible clearly states it. So I must at least consider how it needs to be formulated and understand it in a systematic way.
Yeah, if it affected no other like peripheral area of theology, we'd still believe it because it's God's nature, and that's the God that we worship, and we don't want to protect his nature. It's like protecting a lion. You don't protect a lion, right? Like right? Like when we look to God's nature, we want to communicate to God's people who God really is, because we really believe eternal life is to know God and Jesus Christ whom he sent. A true knowledge of who God is saving. Yes. When you start taking away the divine attributes of God in such a way that he doesn't act certain ways, you've got to ask yourself, are we still worshiping the God of the Bible? So it's an important thing. We defend that thing. It's a beautiful thing. And this is why we fight for it. So guys, that was a 51-minute, it's almost an hour long on one of the 4 points of this book. But I will be honest, this book worked me up, folks.
Yes, it did.
We have had some polos back and forth and times of repentance for the kind of exaggerated response that I've had towards this book. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. Dawson, thank you for coming. Your research is always greatly appreciated. For those of you who are watching, even blessed by this video, you want to help us produce content like this, there's links in the description to give on PayPal or Patreon. You can give on PayPal any amount, one-time gift, or Patreon, be a weekly giver. If you're watching this video now, it should be this week or next week that we're coming out with the Gospel of Mark. It should be an exciting series that we're going to be flowing through. And that series is with Dr. Craig Keener. I think there's 19 videos with Dr. Craig Keener going through the Gospel of Mark. Your generous contributions help us produce content just like that. So thank you so much for all that you guys do. And we're going to see you next week or maybe tomorrow, depending on when we film this next video. Blessings, guys.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Remnant Radio. If you like this video, we actually put together a playlist that has a whole bunch of content just like what is in this video. So I hope you enjoy, and if you got a little bit of extra spare time, maybe check out some of those other videos.